This year in June, the world will revisit progress over 20 years since Rio 1992. I think two things stand out that are going to define also either the consequences out of this summit or perhaps a lack of progress. One is the net balance sheet of the last 20 years, and we know already that in many respects we have seen an extraordinary amount of innovation emerge across countries, societies, communities, the private sector, under the broader umbrella of sustainable development issues and Agenda 21. But as we in the United Nations Environment Programme also showed in the Megatrends report, basically on virtually all indicators since 1992 up to this year, we have actually not turned the corner. Which means that as the world meets in Rio in June this year, it has to confront a very stark reality. On many of the trends that are undermining the planetary boundaries concept or the sustainability notions that we have developed, issues of equity and sustainability amongst nations and within nations, we are actually heading towards a much more complex and much more risky future. The agenda in Rio this year is centered around the notions of the green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication, the institutional framework for sustainable development, and also the recently emerged notion of a sustainable development goals framework. In between the lines of all of these three topics, there are many issues, initiatives that will be discussed, but I think the contours of the summit are now clear. Transitions towards a green economy as a response to where sustainable development has, in many respects, perhaps gotten stuck over the last 20 years. Not being able to tackle this domination of the economic growth paradigm that has so often marginalized notions of sustainability and equity as enabling future development. It's a debate that should not only happen in theory, but it should actually lead to some very practical and consequential steps that heads of government and ministers will agree in Rio. On the institutional framework, I think we are now at a point where we must recognize that the instrument of the Commission on Sustainable Development has not provided that umbrella framework within which to track progress and also accelerate progress on the Sustainable Development Agenda with the integration of all three pillars, the institutions that should come together to work as one on this. Therefore, the reform of that area in the United Nations is hopefully one that the summit will address, and whether the outcome is a Sustainable Development Council or another form of a meta-level framework within which nations but also these different sectors can work together is one expectation I think we all have. On the environmental governance front, I think the world has now reached the point where the strengthening of the ability of environmental governance to be empowered to deliver a more consequential and authoritative input to the overall Sustainable Development Agenda is essential. Whether it takes the form of a specialized agency upgrading UNEP or some other form of universal membership remains to be seen. But I think if Rio in 2012 once again misses the opportunity of giving the environmental dimension of sustainable development a greater political and mandatory authority, not to regulate the world, but rather to catalyze progress through norms and scientific approaches, global agreements and protocols, it will be a chance that we will not have for another 10 or 20 years. And finally, the Sustainable Development Goals. Most significant in their conceptual evolution is the notion that every country has a responsibility on this planet to deliver against the Sustainable Development Agenda and even Agenda 21 and its targets and goals. I think the challenge will remain whether we can define a set of Sustainable Development Goals that are not only interesting in terms of narrative and language, but are, again, consequential in terms of driving on very concrete targets and objectives a common agenda of delivery amongst nations. Common but differentiated responsibilities, yes, but let us also focus a little bit more on the common responsibilities, and in this case particularly also on the industrialized nations that have to be part of that agenda for moving forward towards sustainable development. That at least is how we would like to see, from a UNEP perspective, Sustainable Development Goals articulated in Rio, or at least initiated in Rio, for further discussion after that.